somewhere on the grasslands north of the Black Sea where the wind has moved. Across the same open country for 10,000 years, there are low mounds of earth, scattered to the horizon. Burial pits covered in turf marking the graves of a people who died 4,500 years ago. Nearly half the human beings alive today speak a language descended from theirs. For most of the last century, the textbooks called them a marginal, pastoral culture on the edge of Europe, a scattering of herders, a regional. Footnote. Then ancient DNA was pulled from the bones beneath those mounds. And when the results came back, almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. The Yamnaya were never who we were told they were. And what the genetic record revealed is that most of the modern world is in some measurable sense still them. To understand what the DNA overturned, you have to first understand what the DNA was overturning. And that means going back to a culture that sat on the edge of academic respectability for most of the 20th century, dismissed as peripheral, studied with the wrong tools and filed under the wrong heading in nearly every textbook that bothered to mention it at all. The Pontic-Caspian steppe is a belt of grassland that runs from the northern shore of the Black Sea east across what is now southern Ukraine and southern Russia to the Caspian. Flat country, dry summers, cold winters. Not much timber, not many rivers of any consequence once you leave the valleys. Between roughly 3,400 BC and 2,500 BC, a people lived and died on that grassland and left almost nothing behind, except their dead. They buried them in pits, sometimes with stairs leading down into the ground, sprinkled with red ochre oriented west to east, laid on their backs with their knees raised, and over each grave they raised a low mound of earth, a kurgan. Russian archaeologists named the culture Yamnaya from the word for pit. The grave was the signature. The grave was almost the only thing left. For most of the last century, the story attached to these burials was modest, semi-nomadic pastoralist, a regional pastoral tradition, some copper, some bronze stone axes, a handful of wagon parts. Nothing that looked from the outside like the foundation of anything. They were a curiosity of Eastern European prehistory, studied by specialists mentioned in footnotes, and rarely treated as historically important. There was one dissenter. In the 1950s, a Lithuanian-American archaeologist named Maria Gimbutas proposed that the steppe cultures, the Yamnaya and their immediate predecessors, had spread the Indo-European family of languages across Europe through successive waves of migration. She called it the Kurgan hypothesis. Her colleagues in the mainstream of the field treated it as speculation at best, and ideological fantasy at worst. The preferred theory was that Indo-European languages had spread peacefully with farming from Anatolia in the Neolithic, carried by seed grain rather than by horsemen. The dispute could not be settled with the evidence available. Pottery fragments can be interpreted in a dozen ways. Burial customs spread through imitation as easily as through migration. Architectural styles cross borders with traders and craftsmen. For half a century, the two camps argued past each other, and the Yamnaya sat in storage their bones in museum drawers, their kurgans mapped and catalogued but unread in any deep sense. The tools were simply not there yet. Nobody could sequence the genetic material in a 4,000-year-old femur. Nobody could trace a paternal lineage through a grave good. Nobody could compare a skeleton from a kurgan in Ukraine to a living person in Ireland and say with any confidence whether they shared an ancestor. The textbook version of the Yamnaya was built before the most important evidence could be read. It was a story constructed in the absence of the one thing that could actually answer the question. When that evidence finally arrived, it did not gently revise the textbook version. It inverted it. Ancient DNA analysis is exactly what it sounds like. Scientists extract genetic material from skeletal remains that have been in the ground for thousands of years, sequence it against modern genomes, and build a biological portrait of who those people were, where they came from, and how they are related to the population still living today. For most of the 20th century, this was not possible. The technology did not exist. Then in the 2010s, the methods reached a level of precision that allowed researchers to read readable DNA from bones that had been sitting in museum drawers for 100 years. And when they turned those methods on the skeletons, pulled from the kurgans of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the results did not quietly revise the story of the Yamnaya. They rewrote the demographic history of half the planet. Roughly 46% of the human beings alive today speak an Indo-European language as a first language: English, Spanish, Hindi, Russian, Persian, Greek. Nearly every major European language and many of the largest languages of South and Central Asia trace back to the same ancestral tongue. The DNA showed that almost every one of those speakers carries ancestry traceable to the Bronze Age population. buried under those low earth mounds on the steppe. That alone would have been a major finding, but the scale of what had happened was more extreme than anyone had expected. Between 5,000 and 4,200 years ago, a small group of people from the steppe spread westward across Europe so rapidly and so completely that in some regions, the existing population was almost entirely replaced. In Britain, genetic sampling of skeletons from before and after the arrival of the bell beaker culture, people descended directly from the Yamnaya showed that over 90% of the pre-existing population had been overwritten within a few generations. The Neolithic farmers who had built Stonehenge, the people who had lived in the British Isles for 2,000 years, were genetically almost erased. This was not migration in the ordinary sense. It was not trade contact or cultural diffusion or slow intermarriage. It was a demographic event without many parallels in the human record. And the population doing the overriding was, by Bronze Age standards, astonishingly coherent. The DNA from a Yamnaya individual buried in what is now Slovenia at the western edge of the expansion shared close, common ancestors with the DNA of Yamnaya-related individuals buried in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, 4,000 miles apart, identifiable as members of the same extended population separated by a continent of terrain distinguishable from the peoples they had passed through on the way. This was not a scattered network of unrelated herders. It was something tighter, something organized enough to hold together biologically across distances that should have pulled any prehistoric population apart by the time the sequencing was complete. The Yamnaya had been reclassified. They were not a regional footnote. They were not a peripheral pastoral culture. They were the ancestors of something close to half the modern world, identified by a technology that had not existed when the textbooks were written, and confirmed by evidence their own descendants had been carrying unknowingly the entire time. For a long time, nobody knew what these people had actually looked like. The skulls sat in museum collections. The grave goods were catalogued, a handful of stone stelae. Weathered figures carved with belts and weapons and shepherd's crooks hinted at posture and dress, but not at faces. Then the genetic data caught up with the forensic reconstruction, and for the first time the Yamnaya could be built from the skull out. The 3D artist Robert Molyneux used CT scans of actual Yamnaya skulls and combined them with genetic data on pigmentation, hair color, and eye color to produce reconstructions that are the closest thing to a photograph of these people that has ever existed. The method itself is exacting. The skull is modeled in 3 dimensions. Flesh thickness is calculated at each anatomical landmark using a revised version of the Gerasimov technique, the same method used in modern forensic identification. Skin is added. Hair and eye color are assigned based on the most probable phenotype indicated by the ancient genome. What emerged was a face broad, straight-jawed, prominent nasal bones, heavy brow ridges on the men. The eastern Yamnaya from the lower Volga had long and narrow skulls, the dolichocephalic type. The western Yamnaya, closer to the Black Sea, had rounder skulls, the brachycephalic type. The populations were genetically almost identical, despite the cranial difference, a reminder that skull shape alone can be misleading as a marker of ancestry. They were tall. The average Yamnaya male stood between 170 and 177 centimeters, somewhere between 5 feet 7 inches and 5 feet 10 inches. That reads as ordinary today. In the Bronze Age, it was striking. The farming populations of Western Europe at the same period rarely cleared 5'4". The Yamnaya towered over their neighbors, and at least some of them towered over their own kin. A male skeleton excavated from a barrow in the Bulgarian village of Vetrin has been nicknamed Hercules by the locals. Femur length places him at a minimum of 190 centimeters, over 6 feet 3 inches, in 3200 BC. The skin tone sat at the darker end of the modern European spectrum. Dark hair, mostly brown eyes. The alleles for blonde hair and blue eyes were already present in the Yamnaya gene pool inherited from ancient ancestors, but they were dormant in almost every individual sequenced. The Yamnaya themselves were not the fair-haired, pale-eyed peoples of northern Europe today. Those features emerged later, selected for over the course of the Bronze Age and their descendants long after the steppe was left behind. The stelae found on their barrows show men with beards shaped into points centuries before any Viking did the same. Belts, weapons tucked at the waist, sandals, in some depictions naked except for the belts in others. Shepherds' crooks, stone axes. This is the closest the evidence allows us to come. A tall, dark-haired, heavily built people, the men bearded and armed, the women occasionally buried at the center of kurgans as equals. A population that looks at first glance almost modern. and then on a second look carries a presence no living group quite reproduces. They have been staring back at us from those skulls for 4,000 years. The question that follows is the obvious one. How did so few people overwrite so much of the world's genetic landscape? The answer is not mystical. It is mechanical, and it arrives in layers. The first layer is mobility. The Yamnaya lived on wheels. They did not invent the wagon. The oldest image of a wagon comes from a clay cup excavated at Bronachich in southern Poland, securely dated to between 3,500 and 3,300 BC. The oldest wheel ever found was pulled from a marsh at Ljubljana in Slovenia, dated to around 3,150 BC. The Yamnaya took an existing technology and built an entire civilization around it. Wagons carried the heavy loads, tents, water, food belongings. Whole households moved with the seasons. And alongside the wagons came something rarer: horses. The Yamnaya were among the earliest people on Earth to ride domesticated horses. A recent paper by Taylor and Ortiz concluded that the Botai people of Kazakhstan, long credited with the first horse domestication, may not have domesticated their horses at all, and that modern horse breeds descend almost entirely from a separate domestication event linked to the Yamnaya. Horseback riding turned herding from a regional activity into a continental one. Scouting, trading, raiding, driving cattle across hundreds of miles of open country. The same pairing that would define cavalry warfare for the next 4,000 years began on the Bronze Age steppe. The second layer is diet. The Yamnaya consumed enormous quantities of dairy, so much in fact that some children in the Middle Volga region showed signs of anemia from the iron-blocking effect of excessive milk intake. A genetic study in 2020 confirmed that roughly a quarter of adult Yamnaya carried the gene for lactase persistence, the mutation that allows raw milk to be digested past infancy. Their neighbors could not do this without processing the milk into cheese or yogurt. The Yamnaya could drink it straight from the animal. Fats, proteins, calories absorbed directly. The third layer is health. A study by Behrens and colleagues in 2017 titled "The Genomic Health of Ancient Hominins" found that ancient pastoralist populations carried unusually clean genomes, particularly for the genetic markers associated with cancers, immune disorders, periodontal disease, and gastrointestinal illness. Compared to contemporary hunter-gatherers and early farmers, the pastoralists of the steppe were biologically well-positioned to resist the conditions that most often killed people in the Bronze Age. The fourth layer is violence. The grave goods tell a consistent story. Bronze daggers, stone axes, high-status males buried with weapons at the hip. And the archaeological record of the regions they entered tells the other half of the story. At Uhlau, in what is now Germany, a mass grave was excavated containing the remains of a late Neolithic farming community that had been slaughtered by Yamnaya-related corded were invaders, men, women, and children killed together in a single event. Taller, stronger, more mobile, better fed, healthier, armed with the finest metal of their age, arriving at the edge of Neolithic Europe with momentum no farming village could match. By the time the Yamnaya reached the Atlantic, the replacement was already underway. One question remained, and it is the question that still divides the field. Where did the Yamnaya themselves come from? The DNA tells a clear first part of the answer. The Yamnaya were not a pure lineage that appeared on the steppe fully formed. They were a mixture of two earlier populations. The first was a group known to geneticists as Eastern hunter-gatherers, people who had lived on and around the steppe for thousands of years, descended ultimately from the ancient North Eurasian lineage that spread across northern Asia during the Ice Age. The second was a signal called Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry, and the origin of that second signal is where the argument begins. For a decade, some of the most prominent geneticists in the field have argued that the Caucasus component entered the steppe from the south. A paper by Lazaridis and colleagues in 2016 associated the signal with Neolithic farmers from what is now Iran. A 2019 paper by Wang and colleagues working with the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig went further in its preprint and proposed that the Maykop culture, situated on the northern slopes of the Caucasus, was the ultimate source of the Proto-Indo-European language itself. That would make the Maykop, not the Yamnaya, the original speakers. It is not a small claim, and it has not been universally accepted. The problems with the southern origin theory are specific and difficult to dismiss. The Caucasus ancestry in Yamnaya genomes is more closely related to hunter-gatherers from what is now Georgia than it is to Iranian Neolithic farmers. And if farming populations had crossed the mountains to reach the steppe, they would have carried the genetic signature of Anatolian farming ancestry with them. That signature is almost completely absent from early Yamnaya skeletons. The people who contributed the Caucasus signal were hunter-gatherers, not farmers. They arrived before the Neolithic reached the region. And they left no detectable male lineages in the Yamnaya paternal record, which points to a small and one-directional contact rather than a wholesale migration. The clearest correction came from David Anthony, the archaeologist whose work on Indo-European origins has defined the field for 30 years, and who now works alongside David Reich's team at Harvard. On Razib Khan's podcast in the last year, Anthony addressed the question directly. The Caucasus-like genetic component, he said, was present on the steppes and up the Volga more than 8,000 years ago. It cannot have come from any Neolithic population south of the mountains because those populations carried Anatolian farming DNA that is simply not there in the early steppe samples, which means the mixture event that produced the Yamnaya happened on the steppe itself. The Caucasus-like ancestry was already in place long before farming reached the region, carried north by hunter-gatherers across the mountains in a period so deep in prehistory that the usual markers of Neolithic migration do not apply. The steppe hypothesis, in other words, has been proven correct. The Yamnaya spoke an early form of Proto-Indo-European, and the language spread with them westward and eastward across the continent. But the ultimate birthplace of the population that carried it has not yet been pinned down. The evidence points inward, not southward. The answer is still somewhere on the grass. The Yamnaya did not survive as a named people. By 2500 BC, the culture had fragmented into its successors. The catacomb culture on the steppe itself, the corded ware across Central and Northern Europe, the bell beakers pressing westward to the Atlantic and into the British Isles. The Afanasyevo, genetically almost identical to the Yamnaya, carried 4,000 miles east to the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, where their descendants would eventually contribute to the Indo-European speaking peoples of the Tarim Basin. The name faded, the population did not. What they carried outward is still with us. The kurgan itself spread with the language. Ancient Greeks raised mounds over their heroes. Celts did the same. Vikings, Slavs, Anglo-Saxons, Scythians. The Turkic hordes of the medieval steppe continued the tradition 4,000 years after the first Yamnaya pit was dug. The horse sacrifice, which appears in a Yamnaya barrow near Tsatsa, south of the Volga, and in a neighboring grave containing 40 neatly arranged horse skulls, reappears in Vedic India and early Rome in the royal burials of Scandinavia. The same ritual, the same animal, the same association with kingship and with the passage of power from the living to the dead. The social structure traveled with the ritual. The reconstructed vocabulary of Proto-Indo-European preserves an asymmetry that is not accidental. The words for grandfather, father, brother, and husband's brother survive in nearly every Indo-European language clearly derived from a common ancestor. The equivalent words for a wife's family are fragmentary and inconsistent, often reinvented in each branch. That is the linguistic fingerprint of a patrilineal patrilocal society. Men stayed. Women left their birth families to live with their husbands. The rule that shaped kinship on the Bronze Age steppe shaped it across the Indo-European world for thousands of years afterward. The genetic imprint is still measurable. Yamnaya ancestry runs highest in northern and eastern Europe, where the population replacement was most complete, and the steppe component was least diluted by earlier farming lineages. A study published on Estonian genomes found that the taller an individual was, the more closely their DNA resembled Yamnaya reference samples. Increased Yamnaya ancestry correlated with stronger builds, larger frames, broader hip and waist measurements, and curiously with darker hair and eye color among modern Estonians. The features that define the steppe population are still being carried by the people living on the land those people never reached. The haplogroup record is the clearest single marker. The paternal lineage, known as R1b, dominant today across Western and Northern Europe, traces back through the bell beakers to the Yamnaya themselves. Half the men in Ireland carry it. So do tens of millions of men across Britain, France, Spain, and beyond. Every one of them descends in the male line from a small group of Bronze Age herders who died on the Pontic-Caspian steppe more than 4,000 years ago. They vanished as a people. They have never left. They survive in the words we use in the inheritance rules of the societies we grew up in the shape of the mounds that still dot the landscape from Ireland to the Altai. And in the bones of the people reading this, return to the steppe, the wind, the grass, the low mounds of earth scattered to the horizon, each one covering a pit dug by people who have been dead for 4,500 years. For most of the last century, the textbook called them marginal, a regional pastoral culture, a footnote on the edge of European prehistory. The DNA has called them foundational. Nearly half the spoken world traces its language back to them. Tens of millions of men carry their paternal line. Their kinship rules their burial customs. Their sky gods and their horses traveled with the language for 4,000 years and have not finished traveling yet. The real surprise of the Yamnaya is not who they were. It is how long it took the rest of us to recognize that most of us are in some measurable sense still them.